InsightLA Sunday morning sitting group. My name is Trudy. I'm the founding teacher of InsightLA. Kind of formally retired from InsightLA, but of course, InsightLA was my baby, so I'm never gonna I'm never gonna leave completely. But I have officially retired, but this group is going to continue to support InsightLA, and um, yeah. And we begin with a land acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement, it's just a very simple, excuse me, it's a very powerful way. It's a step toward correcting the erasures of Indigenous people who lived on the land that we are on. This morning, today, some of you, it's not morning, I'm actually in Marin County in San Rafael, and so the people here that I want to acknowledge, these unceded lands belong to the Coast Miwok people, and they were the inhabitants of what we know as Marin County and southern Sonoma counties. And they, of course, knew and took care of this beautiful land for thousands of years, and they had a very rich economy. It was developed mostly around fishing and hunting and gathering, uh, but by around the 1700s, the most of the Coast Miwok people were forced into servitude by the Spanish mission builders, and the land was taken over by Spanish and Mexican land grantees, and a lot of the Miwok people died from diseases introduced by the settlers. But their descendants continue to live in Marin County and southern Sonoma County. So just to acknowledge the people and the land where I am, and maybe some of you are also. I haven't looked in the chat. I don't know if you put where you're from in the chat, but it's always interesting to see. Um, and uh, and I want to, well, I'm going to launch into my talk, but before that, we're going to meditate. I realize, oh, I'm launching into the talk, but we're going to meditate first. So it's kind of like settling into, if you really want to read, let's say, a Dharma book, a spiritual book, you really want to receive the teachings, you make sure you have good light, you're comfortable in your chair, you have everything you need, you're settled, and then you're ready to receive. And this is why we meditate first. It's like we just get settled to receive teachings, to reflect on them, and to share them together. And for any of you who may be new to InsightLA, I want to welcome you and to say that we just divide this time roughly into 3 sections. First, we meditate, then I offer some teachings, and then we have some dialogue together. So finding a comfortable frame for your bodies. Going to grab a bell. Oh, I'm just looking at the chat. So we're settling in to wherever you are, wherever I am. It's a sunny day here. It's chilly, but not cold. And there's a cat walking across the driveway. And I see there's snowflake drifting day in South Dakota, raining in Waltham, windy in Orange County. It's amazing that we can meet like this in all kinds of weather. So let's sit together. And we begin by taking 3 intentional, deep, cleansing breaths. Breathing in the aliveness of this moment. And breathing out, relaxing. And one more time, breathing in and relaxing. And one more deep breath in and releasing any tension in the body as you breathe out. And now allowing the breath to move in its own natural rhythm. Feeling the movement of the breath in the body. Noticing the rise and fall of the diaphragm, the belly. The expansion and contraction of the lungs and rib cage. And sensing the coolness of the inhalation and the warmth of the exhalation. Very subtle, you can sense a little bit of that. Tuning into the sounds of life around you. It's as if we're sitting on the banks of a stream, just watching the flow of thoughts and feelings while we sit still. Just tuning in to how it is for you right now in this particular moment of life and this one. and this. Appreciating the reliable movement of the breath without our having to do anything to make it happen. Just allowing the breath to breathe you. Noticing and appreciating the effortless experience of hearing. Sound and hearing just happening. And noticing the touch points, the effortless sensation of the clothing touching your skin, your feet touching the floor or the cushion, the sensation of hands in your lap, on your knees, in a mudra, however the hands are experiencing the sense of touch. And whether your eyes are a little bit open or closed, there is still seeing. You're seeing the light outside of the eyelids. Sometimes seeing patterns behind the eyelids. And assuming you have access to all these sense doors, the sense of smell and taste, they too happen automatically. Smelling always happening, tasting always ready, without any effort of me or you. And then noticing the sixth sense in Buddhist psychology is the mind, the heart, the movements of consciousness and attention. And this superpower we have of awareness, of intention, of being able to direct our attention, opening all the senses, being fully here. So this morning, I want today, it's wherever you are, whatever time it is, wherever you are, I want to talk about this teaching that is really confusing for people in Buddhist psychology about anatta, which means no self or without a self. And I chose to talk about this in response to Liz, who wanted to ask this question right at the end of the sitting group. I'm so glad that you didn't get a chance to ask it right at the end of the sitting group because it's a huge question. People get so confused with this teaching. Um, so I want to just go into it some today and probably also next week because there's lots to this subject. So just to quote from the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length discourses of the Buddha, he says, things are not what they seem. Deeds exist, but no doer can be found. In other words, actions happen, but there's no actor. This makes no sense to our rational linear minds. But this is the teaching, that the idea of an individual self is an illusion and that you can't really separate self from its surroundings. And yet here we are, happily separate selves. Look at all our little Zoom squares. We're separate, right? Happily separate selves. And actually, from a Western psychological perspective, separation actually means individuation. Separation in Western psychology, it really refers to the ability to gain a sense of self, separate from your family, separate from your upbringing. A sense of self being an individual who's empowered to some extent to choose their own path and create their own life. So that meaning of separate is not the one we're talking about here. We're talking about the painful experience of being separate, of being isolated. And uh, and he's saying you can't separate the self from the surroundings. And I want to read the question. I want to read Liz's question because she actually sent it to me in an email and I have her permission to read it to you. And Liz is somebody who has self-described, coming to the Dharma later in life and really having that sense of samvega, of spiritual urgency, because there isn't this sort of endless future that we all imagine stretching out in front of us until we hit certain ages. And then we begin to realize, oh my gosh, maybe it's not forever. I mean, some people actually never realize that, but most people who practice meditation become aware of, at a certain point of life, the future is not extending as infinitely as we imagine for lots of our life. And so I'm going to read the question that Liz sent to me. I'm really struggling with the concept of no self. Oh, and I want to add that you came to the practice later in life, as you said, Liz, but also practicing very intensely and very diligently because of having shed the illusion of a future of endless time where we can put practice on the back burner because someday we'll do a retreat. Someday, when the conditions are right, we'll get to do that. Or someday we'll establish a daily meditation practice, whatever your someday is. She said, I'm really struggling with the concept of no self and that nothing is me or mine, because that's another way that the Buddha teaches about it. It says, this look at the different parts of your body and you identify with them, but nothing is actually you or yours. I understand the concept of conditioning, but I have a self that is changeable and open to growth. It doesn't bother me that it's conditioned. My feeling is that it's irresponsible to discard the concept of self. I need to be responsible for my actions and thoughts. Now, there's a lot in here. I'm just going to read it all and then not address it one by one. I need to be responsible for my actions and thoughts. They may be impermanent and open to change, hopefully, but they are mine at the moment. As Wes Nisker says, and I've been quoting Wes a lot recently since he passed away not long ago this summer. As Wes Nisker said, you are not your fault, but you are your responsibility. This is really driving me nuts, and in a way, it makes me want to turn away from Buddhism. The whole issue about self is a very tough one for me. As I mentioned, I take responsibility for my choices and actions very seriously. I don't want to let anyone off the hook, including myself, just because their self is conditioned. And what I love about these questions is that they really do kind of summarize a lot of the issues that people have with this teaching. After all, we have a sense of being someone here, right? I feel like I'm someone and I'm talking to you and you're someone. And I think no self doesn't mean that we don't exist. You know, it's like you hear teachings about emptiness too, and emptiness doesn't mean that we don't exist, or that it refers again to this underlying non-separation of life and this endlessly creative, uh, fertile, creative energy of life that gives rise to all the forms, you, me, the bell, my lukewarm coffee, all of it. Uh, our world and our sense of self it's like, I don't know if anybody uses the expression kaleidoscope anymore, but it is like a kaleidoscope. This incredibly, just turn the kaleidoscope and there's this shifting play of patterns and shapes. And it's really more like that. So when Ajahn Chah, who was actually Ajahn Suchito's teacher, because I'm mentioning that because Ajahn Suchito was Liz's first teacher, and I like to also sometimes listen to his talks because he's been a monk most of his life. So when Ajahn Chah was asked about this Buddhist teaching of no self, he said it wasn't true. Now, obviously, this is a great uh, Thai forest tradition meditation master. What does he mean? What does that mean? Does that mean the self is true if no self is not true? What did he mean by that? So what he was doing, like all great teachers do, is point to a paradox at the heart of the way that the Buddha offered these teachings. And it's great because to become wise in this life, we actually have to learn how to hold these paradoxes. I don't know how many of you receive my newsletter. If you get it, just raise your hand, because if you didn't, I'd love for you to subscribe to it, because I put a lot of thought into those little paragraphs, really a lot of thought and reflection. And one of the things I was talking about in this particular newsletter, and you can go on my website, trudy@trudygoodman.com, and subscribe, or you can put your name in the chat and Camille can copy it for me. I mean, put your email, in the chat. And Camille, thank you for being our moderator today, by the way. And Camille can copy it for me, and I'll make sure that you receive the newsletter. But one of the things that I was talking about was, and this teaching is actually, I think in these times, these are tough times with a whole new horrible war. And it's helpful, I think, to go back to the core teachings of how we change our consciousness, because both individually and in the world, we desperately need that. So thank you for very timely this question, because it sort of takes us back to these core teachings. And one of the things that I was saying in the newsletter was just, that in this horrible war, everyone, Israelis, Palestinians, is in so traumatized and so much fear and so much pain, they cannot possibly sympathize with each other. It's just not possible. And right now. And I was reading an article by Yuval Harari where he said, because people were, there's this sense of helplessness, like, what can we do? And he was saying, well, what you can do is create peace. Just be at peace. I'm completely paraphrasing. It wasn't quite that dharmic, but be at peace, create some space of peace. And later on, when the pain has eased, everyone can be there. We can join you there, I think he said. We can join you there. So I was talking about how do we create a zone of peace, and it's through this embracing of paradox that we can hold these opposites in our hearts, the opposites of love and hate. And I've talked about this before. Anybody who lives in a family or a long-term committed relationship understands that there's moments where we love and moments where we hate. We can hold them both. I'm talking about it in a personal way, but the opposites of joy and grief or sorrow, the opposites of pleasure and pain, the opposites of outrage and acceptance, so many opposites. And my first teacher, this Korean Zen master that I've talked about so many times, Daesan Snim, he used to say, I always felt like he was looking directly at me when he said this. He used to say, don't make a line between the opposites. Don't make a line. He was saying, don't see things in opposites, black or white, or all or nothing. He was talking about being able to hold these opposites in our mind, in our hearts, being able to, not that we feel them simultaneously, we don't, but that we can understand and accept that we have these paradoxes within us. And the teaching of self and no self is one of those. And, as I'm speaking, and this is true always, but maybe especially today, just take what resonates for you, what connects for you, what works for you, and leave the rest if it doesn't. You can just listen and sense which of these teachings are beneficial for you at this time. So on one side, the teachings of liberation, they do emphasize not self. To simplify it a little more, Ajahn Buddhadasa, another great Thai forest meditation master, he called it, and I think this is a more accessible definition for us, not self-centered, not preoccupied with self. And the self that the Buddha is saying does not exist is the self that we construct from our experience, that we imagine to exist independently of everything else. Just me, myself, and I here, that we imagine is separate, that we imagine is permanent, that it's with me till the day I die, it's permanent. And this is, I think it's Bob Stolaroff, the psychoanalytic tradition. He called it the myth of the isolated mind. That in fact, and this is a psychological way to understand it that I think is more accessible than some of the direct experiences of non-self that you can have in meditation. But he says, just understand that experience is always co-created between different minds, and maybe it's the mind of nature and my own mind, but experience is co-created experientially. We think about these things. We think about these things as abstract questions, but they actually only exist in experience. Um, and we imagine that there's some kind of central headquarters, right? A concept of some inferred, reified means made into a thing or an object, some inferred, assumed, reified someone in the center of experience. And actually, that self is a story that we carry of someone to tell our experience to tell our stories to. I mean, I remember one time in a silent retreat, this was toward the beginning of my practice, when silence was a challenge and it was different. And I remember I wasn't talking to anybody, so I was following the rules and being silent. But in my head, I was talking about everything. I was telling myself stories about how delicious this food was and how icky that food was, or how just constant, like I often say, that constant comment. I was telling myself stories all day long about everything. And so in practice, this no self is an invitation to let go, to stop that story making activity of the self, to just release and be free of the things that we usually identify as me and mine, our opinions, right? Oh, our cherished opinions. I really cherish my opinions. I don't know about you. Our attachments. And again, attachment is a tricky word because in Western psychology, attachment is an achievement, to be able to be in relationship. And some of you have heard of attachment theory, the theories that describe our different ways of being in relationship. Are we avoidant? Are we connected? And how those ways are conditioned by our upbringing. So being able to be attached in Western psychology is an achievement. It's a good thing, right? It means you can be connected in relationship. But attachment in Buddhist psychology is very different. It refers to being stuck on things, to being rigid about things, to being attached in the sense of, like I said, I'm very attached to my opinions or my views, my politics, I'm just using examples. And attached in Buddhist psychology also means attached to the idea that I control my experience, or that I can control my experience, or that it's worth trying to control my experience. And I'm not talking about controlling experience in the sense of having an intention about where you direct your intention. I'm talking about being controlling, and that means something completely different. And you can look at your life and see where these things cause trouble. It's not hard to see. And so these teachings are actually an invitation to move from me to we. But they are problematic if we understand them as erasing individual identities, especially if we understand them as erasing, the individual identities that cause sexism, racism, ageism, all the problematic isms that divide and separate us. And again, this is a paradox, right? How do we hold the fact that actually, as Thich Nhat Hanh called it, interbeing, we interbe with everything. And yet at the same time, we interbe, but we aren't melding and erasing our personal identities. Both can coexist so that we don't have to reify and attach to a self that doesn't exist apart from everything else. And we don't have to say, well, I'm nobody, I don't, this isn't, this is all an illusion. Injustice is an illusion. Racism is an illusion. Sexism is all an illusion. We're all one. Yes, in the deepest sense, that's true, actually. the oneness of everything. But as my first teacher, again, he had these really clear Dharma sound bites. And he would say, if you had an experience of oneness and you reported that in your meditation, he'd say, you understand one, but you don't understand two. Or he would say, you understand two if you're really stuck on yourself in some way or another, being very preoccupied with yourself. He said, but you don't understand one. How do we understand both? How do we hold sameness and difference? Practically the whole tradition of Zen is the exploration of these paradoxes. So if you don't relate to it, it's not just you. This is a huge question for our human hearts, our human psyches. I want to read you the end of a poem that by David White. I think it's called "The House of Belonging." I just copied the end, not the title, but I think it's called "The House of Belonging," and it goes like this. This is the last 3 stanzas. He says, "This is the bright home in which I live. This is where I ask my friends to come. This is where I want to love all the things that it has taken me so long to learn to love. This is the temple of my adult aloneness, and I belong to that aloneness as I belong to my life." And then he ends by saying, "There is no house like the house of belonging." So you see, poets, they always can capture these paradoxes of life. This is the temple of my adult aloneness. This is me, Trudy. This is you, Liz, and all of you. This is the temple of my adult aloneness. And I belong to that aloneness, that solitude, you could say, but he is using deliberately aloneness as I belong to my life, as I belong to the ever-changing, unfolding flow of experience that I call my life. And when he says there's no house like the house of belonging, it almost brings tears to my eyes, because that sense of belonging to life, when you have that sense, then there is not really a problem with being alone. That's not to say that we don't, sometimes, I get lonely sometimes. We need to have friends. We're social creatures for the most part. Even if you're an introvert, you like to see somebody sometimes. And, but that house of belonging, it's the mind house that's big enough to hold it all. Again, I just am really thinking of Sansanin this morning. He would talk about how when you're only sort of encapsulated in your separate self, you're stuck in your mind house. And that was his expression for the small, separate mind. And then he would say, step out of your mind house. Outside your door is a land of stillness and light, where spring comes and the grass grows by itself. And that's what I was sort of pointing to in the guided meditation that we did this morning. Seeing how, this is assuming everyone has access to all their sense doors, which is a huge assumption because everyone doesn't. But whichever sense doors you have access to, they function on their own, like the breath. We don't have to remind ourselves, usually, to breathe. We might have to remind ourselves to take a deep breath sometimes, but seeing happens, hearing happens, sensing, sensation happens. It doesn't require my intervention or control. It happens. spring comes and the grass grows by itself. Well, it's fall here. It's a weird fall because I just went to the farmer's market this morning, early, and there's still strawberries up in Northern California at the farmer's market. That's unseasoned, that's unusual. The deciduous trees are still green. It's it's an unusual fall, but at the same time, nobody has to tell the trees when to drop their leaves. Nobody has to tell the strawberry vines when to stop producing fruit. This is part of I would call the furniture of the house of belonging. Um, Thich Nhat Hanh teaches it very beautifully. He talks about his body being made up of the rain, the clouds. He's talking about the elements, right? The water, the air, the earth, the fire, the warmth of the body. And I think for today, just so we have a chance for some dialogue, I'll say that these teachings, what they ask of us who follow a path of awakening, what they ask of us is to reflect on our own life and to be aware, to sense where are you clinging? Where am I stuck? What are the sort of rigid views that I hold? Where are my attachments? And I'm not talking about the attachments of our people, but the things I get stuck on. Where are they? And what about my inability to forgive? That's one of the places it's so easy to get stuck. And what would it mean to just practice here, now, in this domain of possibility of each moment and become free? So this is what I want to share with you this morning of these teachings, and we'll probably continue them next week because it's a big subject.